My name is John Roskam. I'm a Senior Fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs. Welcome to this edition of IPA Encounters with Professor David McGrogan. In this episode, we'll be talking with David about freedom in the modern world. David is one of the English-speaking world's most interesting and thoughtful writers on freedom. His work has appeared in the Daily Skeptic, and of course the Daily Skeptic is published by a good friend of the IPA's, Toby Young, who's been a guest on IPA Encounters. And David's work has also appeared on the Critic, Law and Liberty, and the Brownstone Institute. David is currently an Associate Professor of Law at Northumbria Law School, and his extensive scholarly research and record includes a significant book, Critical Theory and Human Rights, From Compassion to Coercion, which explains that human rights today has very little to do with personal freedom. David has a brilliant Substack, which I can't speak too highly of. It is compulsory reading. It's titled News from Uncibal, and I might ask David to explain the origins of that title later. David introduces readers to political philosophy, to the meaning of freedom, to the meaning of history, and what this means in the world today. David, welcome to IPA Encounters.
Thanks, John. It's great to be with you. I feel like you've built up expectations here. I'm feeling the pressure. I've got to speak well. I've got to speak authoritatively about modernity and freedom now.
Can I ask you to begin with some background about yourself? You've lived in Japan, you're fluent in Japanese. Can you talk about how you have come to be one of the very few centre-right, freedom-embracing academics working in the field of human rights?
That's a big question. How long have you got? A bit about my background then. So I was born in a very normal kind of like upper working class, kind of educated working class household, I would have said. So I just went to a normal state school. You've
said it's been a Labour voting household.
Yeah, Labour voting household, absolutely. Yeah. So my parents both. So my dad was from the outskirts of Glasgow. My mum was from the outskirts of Liverpool. So yeah, I was very, very left wing. And then I think I just went through a gradual, I guess you'd call it almost like a Damascene. No, well, the opposite of a Damascene conversion, actually, the opposite of a sudden conversion. Because I went to live in Japan, and for people who don't know Japan very well, I think that possibly people think of it as being a very collectivist kind of a society, and the state is undoubtedly very big in the sense that it's got this massive debt to GDP ratio, as you probably know, like 200% now. So it's not as though Japan is like a libertarian paradise or anything like that. But what I was really amazed by, shocked by when I first went to Japan, is that a lot of the things that the British people take for granted as being absolutely necessary, like a national health service that's free at the point of use, like a huge welfare state, which is available more or less from cradle to grave, like massive state ownership of, for example, the public transport system, don't exist in Japan. So I think living in Japan just gave me a totally different perspective on the relationship between the state and society, and I've never quite recovered, I've never quite been the same person since. So
How do your colleagues treat you as someone who is sceptical of an ever-growing state and someone who does support freedom?
It's very, very, it's a very interesting question. I think I get on well with the people who I work with at Northumbria Law School, and I think they're quite a down-to-earth kind of a crowd comparatively for British academics, but certainly, I assume the same thing is also true over there in Australia. In British universities, the idea that the state should be smaller, or the idea that the state should do less, or there should be more individual responsibility, is just completely, it's not so much that it's a bad idea, it's unfathomable to the average academic, and I think this is sort of a broader problem that we see in academia.
So flowing from that, can freedom exist in the modern world, coming to the title of this discussion?
Well, I want to say, I'm tempted to give you a facetious answer and say, yes, it can, but we're going to have to go through a huge amount of pain in order to get.
Do you want to talk about that pain?
Yeah. Well, the way I see things, so I don't want to. Again, I don't want to kind of lecture an Australian about how to suck eggs. I don't know how things are in Australia.
Not a lot better than they are in the UK.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing, because I feel as though. So when I kind of look at news from Australia, what's amazing to me is how you couldn't imagine a more geographically different country from the UK, right? It's vastly bigger, way more space, totally different climate, huge mineral wealth, and you just think to yourself, well, how can it be that Australians are confronting exactly the same issues that we're confronting here in the UK? Like, why is so? It's the same things: immigration, it's the cost of housing, it's the cost of energy, it's kind of wokeness, for want of a better expression.
Growing and pervasive government censorship.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah,
a refusal, and we can come and talk about this, the refusal to deal with things such as the consequences of lockdowns, a failing education system.
Yeah.
So does that say something about modernity itself rather than the notion of the two countries?
Well, it does, yeah, because I've been thinking about, so I don't know if you know this, there's a kid's book called We're Going on a Bear Hunt. I don't know if that's a book that's known in Australia.
It's even known in Australia, yes.
Yeah, so the whole thing about We're Going on a Bear Hunt is you get this repeated phrase that we can't get over it, we can't go under it, we've got to go through it, right? It's like every single obstacle, there's no way around it, you just have to go through. And I kind of wonder if we're in that position now where people have to understand how awful and how miserable socialism, collectivism is in order to actually get through it. Do we have to be like Argentina? Do we have to have 100 years in which you get this kind of Peronist, socialist, gradually deteriorating economic picture, gradually deteriorating cultural picture, until it gets to such a point that you end up with a Javier Milei type figure being elected? Is that what has to happen? I'm not sure, but to kind of put that in a bit more of the kind of bones on that philosophically. So people who read my Substack will know that I'm very constantly going on about Machiavelli, right? Because Machiavelli, in order to understand the position which we're in, I think you have to go much further back into history than we're commonly accustomed to doing. Certainly aren't what my kind of central right kind of commentators, right?
You mean we have to go back to before Hayek and Friedman?
Exactly. Yeah, amazingly, yeah. We have to
go a few hundred years.
A few hundred years or so, yeah. Because, really you have to go back to, because at the end of the day, the human condition doesn't change. So, I was actually just chatting about this on Friday with somebody, Leo Strauss, so I know you like Leo Strauss, basically says that philosophy is a matter of permanent problems, right? There are things that human beings simply have to deal with because of what we are, right? Our nature, our condition. And those don't go away from era to era. So we're really dealing with the same problems that the ancient Greeks were dealing with. It's just in a different kind of technological context, right? But anyway, so Machiavelli, the reason why Machiavelli is so important is that when he was writing, so, kind of roughly late 15th century, that kind of an era, the modernity, as we understand it, as we describe it today, was dawning, right? So gradually, the best way to understand modernity, really, I suppose, is secularization, right? The kind of the understanding that while God may exist, it's not as though people stopped having religious faith in the modern era. We understand religious faith, God, that kind of thing, as being separate to physical reality, right? So there's a break between, you could say, like the theological sphere and the the physical realm or the temporal realm. So we can't, in modernity, accept that the ruler should be there simply by divine right. The job of the monarch is not to reflect in the way he rules, the way that God rules over creation, right? That's not going to fly to a modern, right? And it wouldn't fly to Machiavelli, right? He just rejects that implicitly. He doesn't say it in so many words, because he would have probably been burned as a heretic if he'd said that, but it's clear in the way he was writing, right, that he rejects that view of the relationship between the government and society. So the question then becomes, right, okay, so if you haven't got the divine right of kings anymore, right, so if you haven't got a theological justification for government, then what is the justification? Why should the state exist, right? Why should there be a ruler?
And why should the state tell you how to live? Why should the state tell you what to do?
Yeah, exactly. So that becomes the central question of modernity, right? What's the state for? Why is it there? Why do we have a ruler? And what's the proper relationship between the state and society, and between the state and the individual? Exactly as you put it, right? Why is it that there's some guy sitting in Whitehall who gets to tell me that I have to give 40% of my income to the Treasury? So there are two possible answers to that, right, according to Machiavelli, right? And we have to be really, really careful with the words that we use, because when you say Republican to an Australian or to a British person, they instantly think it's about the monarchy. Okay, so it's not about that, right? So Machiavelli says that we have to, basically there's two answers to the question of the proper relationship between the state and the society, why there should be a government, why there should be a ruler. So one justification would be the Republican justification, which is, again, nothing to do with whether there's a monarchy or not, but whether the governing structure represents the people.
Whether it's an expression of the people.
Yeah, an expression of the people, exactly. So he didn't mean that as a Democrat, right? He wasn't a Democrat. What he meant was, you got this idea that you have society, you have people are basically kind of competent, capable, can run their own affairs, have their own customs and their own norms, which
know what's in their own best interests.
You know what's in their own best interests. Yeah, exactly. And you can see where this is going. And the state is there to just make sure that everything just keeps ticking over, basically. He's like the master of ceremonies. So the job of the state is effectively to protect the physical integrity of the realm, if you like, to stop it from being invaded, and to make sure that there's a system of law, an enforceable system of law, which reflects, as you rightly put it, the people, right? It reflects the norms and the customs and the practices which they already have, right? But just kind of makes that more formal and makes it more structured and makes it enforceable. So there's kind of social stability. So that's your republic. You've then got the rule, and this is what Machiavelli's obviously most famous for, you have the rule of the prince, right? So the other justification for the existence of the ruler is that he does things for the population, makes life better, right? So it improves people's material conditions, and it also improves their moral conditions in some sense, right? It kind of like makes them better as a society, kind of imposes a moral order upon them. And the idea there, of course, that's predicated on the idea that ordinary people can't run their own affairs, don't really know what they're doing, it can't be trusted, are kind of corrupt, like innately, inherently corrupt, and therefore the ruler has to sort everything out for them, right? And that's how the ruler gets the loyalty of the population, is by doing things for them. So he uses this great expression, or this great illustration of that, and he's obviously using, kind of the images that he understood, because of the time in which he was writing. Then he talks about Moses and the Israelites, right? The relationship between Moses and the Israelites was that.
Well, actually, can I read that out? Because you've written about it, and again, this is from your Substack. It was necessary for Moses to find the people of Israel slaves in Egypt and oppressed by the Egyptians, in order that they might be disposed to follow him to escape this servitude.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the rationale of the Prince, right? And that's in the Prince, right? That's one of the most important chapters of the Prince. So the important point there, the point that I emphasized in the Substack entry, and obviously that you can see it for yourself, is that it was necessary to find them as slaves so that they could follow him. So it's not that they were slaves and he just happened to come along and rescue them. It was that it was necessary for him that they were slaves, right? It's necessary for the ruler that the people are corrupt, needy, desperate, vulnerable, and he's going to save them, right? He's going to rescue them, and that's how he's going to justify himself, right, in his position. So as soon as once you've read Machiavelli, then you can see that everywhere. That's just how we're governed, right? It's just wherever you look, increasingly we see the rationale of the prince, right? We're governed in this princely way, the mode of the principality, whereby we're just described as being foolish, untrustworthy, stupid, and also morally undesirable. Like we're all racists. We're all, we're all just like gullible. We'll believe anything.
Before I ask you to talk about whether this process can be reversed or what the next stage of the development of the state will be that maybe might embrace freedom a little bit more.
Yeah.
Can I ask you to talk about what you've just said in relation to Machiavelli to lockdowns? Now, you spoke out bravely on the consequences of lockdowns. You spoke out about the human rights and legal consequences of lockdowns. Can I ask you to talk about Machiavelli and lockdowns and what we might have learned or not learned from those terrible few years?
Well, if I can answer the second half of that question first, John, what really terrifies me is that what we've learned is exactly the opposite of the lesson that we should have learned, which is that the state can do anything. We need money. Okay, we'll just create it. You're worried about getting sick? We can stop that. Don't worry about it. You're worried about dying? Oh, we can make you live forever. Not quite that far, but that's the lesson that seems to have been learned. Amazingly, that seems to be the lesson that seems to have been learned. So to go back to Machiavelli, to sort of go back to the first half of the question, that's the whole rationale of the prince, right? It just goes back to Moses. It's this idea that the state can solve every problem, and that's what it's there for. Actually, is to solve problems on your behalf. You can't, there are two elements to that, right? One is that you can't be trusted. You can't be left to your own devices. You can't decide whether or not to wear a mask. You can't decide whether or not to get vaccinated. You can't decide whether or not to do social distancing because...
You can't decide whether to go to the funeral of your mother.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because if you are left to make that decision, you will make the wrong decision. So therefore, the state has to decide for you, right? So it's partly kind of like a negative, kind of almost, I don't know what the word is, like almost kind of like insulting sort of a tone that's adopted. But on the other hand, isn't it brilliant that we're going to make sure that you don't get sick, that you don't die, that you're vaccinated, that you're protected? Isn't that great? Isn't that wonderful? Aren't we brilliant? So there's kind of this double-edged sword of, you are stupid, you're not trustworthy, you can't make your own decisions, you're terrible, but we are going to make everything better, right? We're so much cleverer than you. We have the technical expertise, and therefore you can trust us.
So what does that tell us about how our freedoms can be regained? Are there any lessons from that about what, and I'll come to political solutions and I'll ask you about political parties in a moment, but for us as citizens, does that tell us something about what we can do for the future?
Well, that's a big question. I think so. Well, to go back to the bear hunt, I'm not sure. So I don't want to sound too bleak and pessimistic. I'm not sure.
I want you to give us agency, David.
Okay, so the thing that we can do is prepare for. So I think as individuals, what we have to do is knowing the direction in which things are going, right? We have to be prepared for that, right? So be prepared for the state to get bigger and bigger, right? Be prepared, for example, sometime in the short to medium term future, there's going to be central bank digital currencies, for example, are going to start being used, right? At first, it'll be an option. I think gradually it'll become less optional as time goes on. I think we're going to face more tax. We're going to face more regulation. We're going to face more
censorship.
Censorship. Oh yeah, big time. Setting central bank digital currencies to one side, we're going to see much more regulation of whether you can even access finance, right? Whether you can have a bank account. I think all of these things are going to play out. And I think it's going to have to get to the point where people are very, very miserable and they realize that this is a bad idea, but we're not there yet. But what we can do as individuals is prepare for that, right? So you have to sort of think about, what are you going to do in that kind of an environment? What options are available to you as an individual in that kind of an environment, right? So I don't want to give people advice, kind of at a personal level, but I think in terms of just thinking about your family, in terms of thinking about your future, in terms of thinking about your finances, reconcile yourself to the fact that in the short to medium term, that's the kind of environment we're going to be in.
So this is happening in the UK after a nominally conservative government of 14 years.
Yeah.
What's happened? What's happened to politics and a nominally, and I don't want to ask you about the specifics of the Conservative Party, but what is it about conservatives and / liberals in politics that has allowed this to occur?
There's a pat answer to that, which is Milton Friedman's answer. Right, I've got Capitalism and Freedom on my bookshelf just there, and he says at the start of Capitalism and Freedom, the main reason why people lose faith in capitalism is because they don't really believe in freedom. And there's kind of so there is an element of that, right? There's this kind of like, we've sort of somehow lost faith in freedom, but that doesn't really answer the question, because then the question is, well, why has that happened? So that is a really, really deep and important question, obviously. But I think the truth of the matter is, I increasingly reflect more and more on what you might call cultural questions, right? So we human beings are, I think, naturally more inclined towards being collectivist, socialist, because of certain just features of human nature, right? We all kind of like the idea of not having to work. We all kind of like the idea of other people supporting us. We all kind of like the idea of being equal, right? Like not there's not going to be anyone who's kind of better than me or in a position of more security than I am. So we all kind of intuitively sort of have a kind of inclination in our what do I want to say? What's the word I want to use? In our kind of, I think sort of the flaws in our character. I'll be clear. I'll go on a limb, right? The worst aspects of our character lead us towards socialism, right? They lead us towards a kind of more collectivist mindset. So somewhere along the line, something's gone wrong where we've sort of allowed those weaker elements of our character to triumph over the better elements of our character, which concern discipline, hard work, the desire to stand on one's own 2 feet, right? The desire to provide for your family, the desire to look after your community, the desire to create a more prosperous world for your children. Because all of those things are just hard, aren't they? They just require more of you.
And I'd argue it goes to what you were talking about earlier. It goes to modernity. When government does this for us and can do this for us, we are inclined to accept it. So if I was to expand what you were just saying and paraphrase it, liberal democracy, the liberal part of it, is a 100-year-old experiment that is now being frayed. The same is how people talk about democracy as basically not being a natural part of the human condition. It is a single episode in history which is not part of our experience of the last few thousand years. So what conclusion about democracy and about liberalism being perhaps experiments rather than taking the Whig view of history, the natural culmination of how we are to live? What conclusions does that then are then drawn from that?
Well, in some ways, it's quite a depressing conclusion, right? Because if you follow that argument through, then you would say, well, in the end, I guess we're all just going to go back to living in a feudal state. What we can do is just preserve the ideas, right? Because as long as the ideas are preserved, then once people have discovered that the alternatives are bad, they'll come back to those ideas, right? So Milton Friedman, just to cite him again, I can't remember the exact phrase, but you might remember it. But it's something like, when people are trying to decide what to do, they look for the ideas that are lying around, right? And they pick up the ideas and go with it. So as long as you've got the ideas there, right, then and they're still there, and we can keep the flame alive, then people will eventually realize that this road we're on leads to a very, very bad place.
Does that then mean, and this is a big debate in conservatism, that parallel structures and institutions have to be established, and that the existing processes, structures, institutions are lost and cannot be regained? Where do you stand on that debate as to whether try and win them back or acknowledge they're lost and start something new?
That's one of the big questions of our time, I think, isn't it? Because it's important to recognise big cultural differences between Britain and between America and Australia, and probably New Zealand and Canada too. So, I was actually thinking about this because I knew I was going to be doing this interview, obviously, with you, and I was thinking about Australia, and how I think British people reflexively think of Australia as being kind of like a younger brother. It's like, oh yeah, we just play them in cricket every 2 years and they beat us, and but other than that, they're fundamentally like the same, But there's a really big difference between Australia and America on the one hand and Britain on the other, which is that we. Obviously nowadays, you have to describe this as being a terrible, evil thing. But for hundreds of years, British people emigrated to Australia and America before Australia, really. I guess it kind of transferred from America to Australia when America got its independence. But people emigrated who were naturally kind of like freedom loving and sort of frontier oriented and kind of wanted to make a better life for themselves. So in Australia, in the Australian character, I think there's a much more self-reliant, freedom-loving kind of a streak, right? That hasn't, I don't think, has diminished entirely, right? So, and you can see that in public discourse in Australia, where guys like you, and Sky News Australia, as another example of this, where there just seems to be just a bigger kind of core of people who want to kick back against the way in which things are going. And you see that in America as well, right? So a much bigger concentration of people who want to create kind of parallel institutions, like the various universities that have sprung up in America and, all the think tanks and whatever they've got over there. Britain is much more small c conservative in that, creating the space for new institutions is so much more difficult because that constituency of pioneering, freedom-loving sorts of people is just comparatively a lot smaller, I think. So we're in the position of having to think about different ways of doing things that are different to what I think will work in Australia or in North America. And so I think we're in the position of having to think about how we can solve the problems that are in our existing institutions. And I think, sadly, that does have to come down to politicians, because in the end, the way British democracy works, it's not a federal system, right? Everything's really comes through Parliament, and it's a system in which there's parliamentary supremacy. So everything in the end really comes down to the government, right? The cabinet, and particularly the figure of the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister is we're going to have to in the end elect, I think, a Prime Minister and who's going to appoint a cabinet to act almost as like a CEO for the country, right? They're going to have to, like Margaret Thatcher did, take on the vested interests and try to create an institutional fight back. And I think one way that might happen is that the Prime Minister is going to have to rediscover that it's actually the Prime Minister, for example, who's the Minister of the Civil Service. The Prime Minister actually, constitutionally, is in charge of the civil service and can get rid of civil servants, therefore, who aren't, for example, willing to properly implement government policy. That's just one suggestion, but I think we're going to have to deal with things in a very different way to how you're going to deal with things in Australia.
And then before I change topics, I just want to ask you about that. Why have Conservatives been reluctant to do that? Why are they, in your view, more comfortable talking about economics, talking about finances, rather than talking about our culture, how we live, our history, our heritage, our community? Is there something about conservatism that lends itself to that, whereas the left, and we won't necessarily go into Foucault now, although you might like to make reference to him, understand culture in a way Conservatives don't seem to?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do think there's probably a slight leaning amongst creative people to begin with towards left politics, because the reason I say that is just because it seems to be a feature of our culture that goes back a very long time, comparatively, right? Certainly back to the early part of the 20th century. The modernist authors were kind of left-leaning, certainly, and I think everything's just got more kind of left-leaning since then. So it's almost as though creative people are kind of, and you can understand why, really. I think to be a great novelist or a great screenwriter, or perhaps to a lesser extent a great musician, you've got to have a lot of empathy, right? Because you've got to be able to project your thoughts into the head of an imaginary person. You have to kind of think about how other people see the world, and it probably makes you more, therefore, compassionate, and gives you maybe an oversized, lionized kind of sense of compassion, which kind of makes you more left-leaning. So I think that's probably an element of it. But I think the bigger element is just that conservatives have become really scared about being called bad names. They've just become quite easily bullied, I think. And that's a huge problem, because it's a huge problem for two reasons. I think it's a huge problem because it means that sensible conservatives have kind of, as you said, they've retreated into economic arguments, because you can't get called a racist then, or a sexist or whatever. So it's kind of like a comfort zone, a comfort blanket even. So that's part of it. But the other reason why it's a problem is that, I'm not by any means somebody who welcomes the return of racial politics, or welcomes, a kind of traditionalist view of the role of women or anything like that. So what happens as a result of conservatives retreating from discussing those topics is that you end up with those topics becoming the purview of people who don't care if they're called a racist, or don't care if they're called a sexist. And those kinds of people are not really necessarily the people you want to be dominating the discussion. So we're in a really
they do dominate the discussion because conservatives have retreated, so they've left the space open for others, for extremists in some ways.
Yeah, exactly. So we need to somehow find a way to just to try to make the case for a more, let's say, a more sensible understanding of the relationships between men and women, and between people who are from different ethnicities, that acknowledges the fact that everyone is of intrinsic equal value as a human being. But that isn't the same thing as being treated in exactly the same way in terms of getting exactly the same outcome, right? So we need to sort of totally rediscover how we discuss that issue, because that's the heart of the problem with wokeness, isn't it? Is this a totally understandable, entirely understandable resentment. If I can, that might be a patronizing word to use, actually, but an entirely understandable reaction to the fact that, yeah, of course there was discrimination in the past, and everyone can understand that and appreciate that. But the solution to that can't be forcing everyone to be equal in terms of outcome, because that's the worst possible outcome you could conceively have.
And right? Then that imposing segregation so that we have theatre audiences of only one colour.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Because that's just a way to breed societal destruction. That's
and that is then the end of liberal democracy. That is the end of the idea that we are equal regardless of our backgrounds.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But I mean, worse than that. I mean, I think worse than the end of liberal democracy. I think that's the end of society. Actually, I think you're talking about then like the kind of political atmosphere of the former Yugoslavia or South Africa, or you're talking about a really, really dark, bad place. Then, right? That's a Pandora's box that we just really don't want to open.
So then, to avoid that bad place, can we conclude by talking about storytelling? You're passionate about fiction and science fiction, and you write it, you analyse it, you talk about it. And I was struck by, again, something you wrote on Substack when you were talking about the conference for the Alliance of Responsible Citizenship in London that I attended, and the discussion at ARC was we need to tell better stories. And in fact, you said, and I'll read out some of what you wrote, we need to tell stories full stop. We need a story, not just a better story. And you wrote this, which I'd like you to talk about. My contention would be that we suffer from a much more serious malady than simply an absence of a better story, which is this, that we leave aside whether the stories we hear are negative or positive or need to be better. We must have a serious and growing commitment to storytelling, full stop. And here we need to think a little more carefully about what the stories are that we tell ourselves and why they are important in structuring our thought. And you go on and you say, in the Sibling Society, the poet Robert Bly gives an interesting definition of adulthood, which you talk about in terms of stories. An adult is able to organise the random emotions and events of his or her life into a memory, a rough meaning, or a story. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So what Robert Bly, I recommend everyone reads that book, by the way, The Sibling Society, because Robert Bly is a very strange man. And I mean that in a nice way. He's a very, very eccentric. He was a very eccentric man. I'm not sure if he's still alive, very old if he is. He was a very, very good poet, and he was a translator of poems as well. But he wrote this book, very, very eccentric book called The Sibling Society, which has an awful lot wrong with it. And there's an awful lot about it that's, it, with hindsight, looks very naive, but there is something in there that I think is very important. But he comes up with this definition of an adult that you've just given, right? An adult is somebody who can, so our lives are just like a random collection of events, or can feel that way, because things just happen to you, right? And you don't really have any control over them. The example I always like to give is my father had a very rare degenerative brain condition. That he gradually lost control of his body and his speech, and just kind of retreated into like a closed world. And obviously, had no control over that, and it just happened kind of randomly. I mean, obviously, there was a cause of it. Nobody knows what the cause is, but it just events just happen, right? And you don't really have any say about it, or very little say about it. Often, there are some things you can have a say in, of course, but a lot of things you can't. So your life is a series of these events, and what an adult has to do in order to be a competent adult, a functioning adult, in order to have some sense that what they're doing matters and is important, you have to be able to think about what all of those random events in terms of a narrative that informs your life, right? You had a past, you have a present, and you will have a future, and those things are connected together, and they what happened in the past, what's happening now, can to a certain extent govern what happens in the future, right? To give you a sense of control over the future, in a sense that the future actually has meaning and is not just a scary place of random happenings, right? And reading fiction allows you to do that, because obviously when you're reading a book, a proper novel, I mean, I shouldn't say that, I shouldn't be snobby, even a trashy novel, even, a John Grisham novel, it has a beginning and a middle and an end. And you're putting yourself in the imaginary position of another person, the main character of the story, or the characters who appear in the story. And you understand their life in terms of a structure, right? A narrative structure, a beginning and a middle and an end. And that helps you to think about your own life in the same way, right? It's not just now, right? It's not just what's happening to you at this moment. What's happening to you at this moment is a result of things that happened in the past and can have some influence, or you can respond to it into the future. And that's what helps you to function as an adult human being, is that idea. And we're in a really bad position, I think, at the moment, partly because fiction reading seems to be dying off amongst young people, but it's being replaced by precisely the kind of development that would lead you in the opposite direction, right? To think that life actually is just a random sequence of events, because what young people seem to do nowadays in their spare time is just open their phone, look at it, open TikTok or whatever it is, and just get this flood of weird random stuff that just kind of like goes into their brain, and they just, like passively kind of absorb. And it's not knitted into this big structure, a narrative structure, right? It's just experienced in the now.
And we're part of a chronology, because when you look at how history is taught, there is no chronology. History is taught as a series of random episodes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, and I mean, you'll tell me more about, I think, because you can give me a better idea about what Australians are probably taught about. I'm assuming some things about what Australians are probably taught about the origin of Australia, as a nation. But, you completely lose the sense of, well, why is it that Britain came to occupy Australia, and why did people from the British Isles end up going there, and what were the decisions they were making? Why did they make those decisions? Why did they seem rational to them at the time? Why were they acting reasonably in their own context? Why is it that they weren't all evil villains, deliberately going to Australia to exterminate the native population? Why is that an oversimplification? And you can only understand the world, or you can only understand your history, right, by exactly as you describe it, understanding it in its context, right? It's part of a big, long story. And importantly, it's a story that has a future as well, right? It's not just now, what's the state of the world now? It's the state of the world across, well, to use your word, a chronology. Yeah.
We've had a wonderful discussion, David. I'm going to ask you two final questions, if I may. Can you explain the title of your Substack? As I said, I think it's compulsory reading. I can't recommend it too highly. It is always engaging and thoughtful and grounded in the sorts of things we've been talking about today. Can you just explain the title and where it came from?
Yeah, so the title is News from Uncibal. So that's just all one word. News from Uncibal is UINCIBAL. At Substack. So newsfromuncibal.substack.com, I guess, is the web address. So Uncibal. I'm a big fan of this American science fiction writer who was a kind of, you could call him like an old-fashioned sort of a libertarian. In that he wasn't very political, but I guess he was just instinctively kind of like a frontiersman kind of a mindset. Called Jack Vance, and he wrote an awful lot of science fiction and fantasy novels, kind of starting in the 50s, and he died, I think, in the early 2000s, 2008 or 9 or something like that. And he was a great writer. He's an acquired taste, so I don't think not necessarily everyone will enjoy what he wrote, because he had a very arch, kind of ironic way of writing that not everyone's going to appreciate, and a very wry sense of humor that I don't think everyone would necessarily appreciate. But so one of the books that he wrote actually, I'll recommend two books that I think should be mentioned in the same breath as 1984 and A Brave New World, in the way that they describe the problems with collectivism. So one of them is called Emphyrio, EMPHYRAO, Emphyrio. That was written in the 1970s. That's one of them. And the other one is this book where Uncibal comes from, which is called Whist. So WYST, Whist. It has a longer title than that, but if you look for Jack Vance Whist, you'll find it. And so Uncibal is the main city on this planet of Whist that Jack Vance came up with. And it's a city which is dominated by a philosophy which the word he uses is egalism, EGAILISM, which is like the desire to be equal. Right. And so it's kind of a bit like 1984, and it's kind of it's sort of like a bit of a metaphor for socialism, but he pushes it in ways that are really unexpected and which make a huge amount of sense to you when you're reading them now.
Can I ask you then a final question, David, to conclude our wonderful discussion? Are you optimistic about the future?
I'm optimistic in the long term for reasons which I said. I think in the long term, I think truth will win. So that, in the long term, truth will defeat lies, and bad ideas will be defeated by good ideas. But unfortunately, we're going to have to. It's a long road to get there. We're going to have to, as I said, go through, I think, some pain before we get there. And to come back to Milton Friedman yet again, just before Milton Friedman died, there's an interview. You can hear it. I don't know if you know of Econ Talk, the podcast, but if viewers want to hear it, you can hear from 2006 an interview with Milton shortly before he died. And the interviewer asks him, are you optimistic? Do you have faith that we've learned lessons? And Milton just says, no, sooner or later, people will completely forget all of the lessons of the 60s, 70s, 80s. They'll rediscover why, socialism is such a brilliant idea. And they're going to have to learn the hard way all over again why it isn't, and I think, sadly, I think that is what we have to look forward to. But so with that proviso in mind that, our job is we just have to keep the ideas going, keep the idea that there is a different way of doing things alive, so that when all of the problems play out as they will, we've got the better ideas that will provide something of a solution, or at least will make things better than they then will be,
David, thank you for being with us on IPA Encounters.
You're very welcome. I really enjoyed it. Thanks.